We're good to go. Welcome. My name is Sergey Radchenko. I'm professor here at SAIS Europe and the director of the Bologna Institute for Policy Research, which hosts seminars every week on a variety of subjects in contemporary history, and contemporary foreign policy, etc. As you know, many of you attend those meetings. And originally, we planned a book launch for my dear colleague Eugene Finkel in connection with the publication of his new book. But then we realized that there was also something else happening. So today we are having a workshop here that is co-hosted by SAIS Europe and the Kissinger Center. And Eugene was a part of that workshop that is taking place in the penthouse. Some of you were there just now. And those of you who were this morning, of course, realize what a depressing, we had a lively conversation, a very depressing subject. And I think as we progressed through the day, it became ever more depressing. And I think it's about to get worse, frankly, because we've decided to integrate this book talk into the program of the workshop. So here we are. We have, obviously, Eugene Finkel here, who's the Kenneth H. Keller Professor of International Affairs and the author of many books, including Ordinary Jews, Choice and Survival During the Holocaust, which was published by Princeton University Press in 2017, A Reform and Rebellion in Weak States, published by Cambridge University Press in 2020, which was co-authored with Skoll Gelbach, and Bread and Autocracy, Food Politics and Security in Putin's Russia, Oxford University Press 2023, which was also co-authored with Janeta Azarieva and Itzhak Brudny. And of course, he's got a new book out that's we're all very excited about, Intent to Destroy. I'm looking forward to hearing more about that. I am in the role of something of a logistical moderator, but I'm very pleased and honored to have today as our discussant the president and CEO of the Center for European Policy Analysis, CEPA, Alina Polyakova, a colleague and an old friend. Alina, thank you for coming. And of course, you're a Kissinger Senior Fellow. Thank you for thank you for telling me what to say in my introductory remarks. Of course, Alina is a perceptive observer of current transatlantic space, of American foreign policy, of Russia and Ukraine. So it is particularly joy to have you here with us, Alina, to serve as the commentator for Eugene's book. So with this, I think what I will do is I will pass the floor over to the two of you. They'll have a fireside discussion. Of course, as you know, for fire regulation reasons, we're not allowed to have fires in this building, but they'll have a fireside chat. And then we will turn over and I will moderate a general Q&A for another 30 minutes or so, or maybe 40 minutes. So we'll see how that goes. So with this, please welcome Eugene.
Well,
or Alina.
I'll kick us off.
Okay.
as the chair of this conversation, because Sergey, I think you started to frame up the substantive discussion really well, and it's just wonderful to be back in Bologna. I've been affiliated with SAIS in different capacities, including in the European Studies program, and now with the Kissinger Center for about 8 years. And I used to teach a class when you were still in Washington, and I think right as you were joining SAIS as well, on Russia and the West of the Cold War. And at the time, which I think was in 2017, I remember that there weren't that many people teaching on this topic until you joined, of course. I think bringing you to SAIS was a strategic decision by the university leadership, and obviously proven to be true, given that you have just published this really important book, a very timely book. And I think as interest in this area, meaning Eastern Europe, Russia, Ukraine, is only growing. And I think despite the many conflicts around the world that we're seeing emerge in quite stark and bright terms, Middle East, other places where we are concerned about future conflict, obviously the Indo-Pacific, and also places where we may not be thinking about a potential armed conflict, but that will surely emerge over the next several years in this geopolitical era of instability and uncertainty. But despite all of that, the war of aggression against Ukraine by the Kremlin, I think, is the most profound security challenge and threat to Europe, to European security, and I would say transatlantic security and the world order. And I think your book takes up that exact perspective and makes a strong case for why Ukraine and Russia's aggression against Ukraine is not just a regional territorial war. There's a long history behind Russia's desires to dominate Ukraine, but also that the implications are far, far wider and bigger that go far, far outside of what might happen in some sort of negotiated solution to end the war. But I think we'll get to the present moment. First, I was really fascinated to see the difference in the two copies of the book, which is of course called Intent to Destroy: Russia's 200-Year Quest to Dominate Ukraine. This is the US copy, and I guess this was for the European market. I think, you know, sometimes you can't judge a book by its cover, and I think both are fantastic covers. We were discussing that this one probably speaks to the spirit of the book more. It's a bit more dark, I would say, and I think the history of Ukraine, unfortunately, has been a history defined by a lot of sorrow and darkness in many ways, but I think a lot of optimism and hope there as well. So without further ado, let me just kick it off. I think the typical question when asked in these discussions is, you know, why did you decide to write this book, and why now? And I will just say I was taken with an anecdote that you share in the introduction, it's also in the acknowledgement section, that you were really affected by an incident that took place while you were still teaching in Washington at SAIS. So maybe you could tell us what that was and how it played into your decision to write this book.
Yeah, so thanks, Sergey, for organizing it. Thanks, Alina, and thank you all for coming. Yeah, and incident would be a nice way to describe it. By the way, as Alina said, there is the book. Unfortunately, we don't have a stand, but you know, I can pass it around if someone wants to grab it. Just make sure to bring it back because those are my copies. So why did I write this book? Well, obviously, I did not plan to write this book. In fact, you know, by 2022, I was working on another book that will probably never get written, and it had nothing to do with Ukraine. I decided that I was done with the region. In fact, so you mentioned us, you know, being at SAIS more or less at the same time, and you're right, you were there when I joined, but back then nobody cared about Russia. In fact, an anecdote, when I was hired at SAIS, I was not hired as a Russia expert. I hired in conflict management. Back then we had several concentrations, and SAIS leadership could not agree whether I actually study Russia, so they decided to offer me a different job. But you know, that's a different story. So why did I decide to write this book? As many other books on the war, it's a war book. I mean, it was a reaction to the war, and you know, the reasons why I wrote it were two. One was intellectual or analytical. After all, you know, I'm an academic, that's what we do. Another was personal. So the analytical one was trying to understand what was going on the ground in Ukraine, because my area of expertise is genocide and violence against civilians. And that's obviously what we saw in Ukraine from the very beginning. You know, obliteration of Mariupol, mass executions in Bucha, and some other more gruesome stuff, like, you know, castrating live POWs with box cutters, you know, beheading people and putting their heads on pikes for everyone to show. And that's something that obviously contradicted quite a lot with the official Russian rhetoric, at least at the very beginning, that the war is the war of liberation, that this war is, to protect the rights of the Ukraine's oppressed Russian speakers. And, I'm not an historian, I'm a political scientist, but I know enough history to tell you that genuine liberation does typically not involve castrating people you are about to liberate. So that was the kind of puzzle, if you wish, that I try to understand, to explain, first of all, the Russian violence against civilians. And, the title of the book is Intent to Destroy. I love the title, but the working title was To Kill Ukraine, and that's essentially what I tried to explain. Russian attempts to kill the state, but also to kill or to destroy Ukrainians as such. That was the analytical reason. And the personal reason, the incident, quote unquote, that you describe, and I also mentioned it in the book. So when I taught at SAIS in DC in 2018, 2019, I had a Brazilian student named Victor Müller Ferreira who took several of my classes, was a smart student, so presumably from Brazil, with an undergrad from Trinity College Dublin. After he graduated, he took my class on genocide, and after he finished this class, after he graduated, he reached out to me and asked for a recommendation letter to work for the ICC. I wrote him this reference letter. It was a glowing letter because he was a smart student. The other reference letters that I wrote for him as well, and then he disappeared, as many of students do, and some of you will disappear on me after you graduate. That was pretty normal. And then, fast forward to 2022, June, the war is going on for several months. I'm very active publicly, I'm writing a lot about the war in Ukraine because, after all, violence against civilians is my topic, and I'm an expert on the region. So I'm very involved in policy discussions that are going on, some publicly, some behind the scenes. So essentially, that's what I do almost 24/7. It's also the summer school that we had this year. It's literally the last day of the summer school. I very much look forward to not teaching for a couple of months anymore. There is a break in the class, so I let the students go back to my office, open my inbox, and then there is an email from a colleague in DC. I won't name him, but he's very connected in the intelligence world, telling me, not just me, but several of our colleagues, expect a story coming out today about a Russian illegal who used to be a student at SAIS and got exposed as Russian military intelligence officer. I see the name, and literally everything around me goes dark. I have no recollection about how I taught the other half of the class, but at some point after I just figured out that I essentially, obviously not knowing and without any intention, but I wrote a letter for a recommendation letter for a Russian spy to apply for the ICC, and he gets the job at the ICC and arrives there, and ICC at that time investigates Russian violence against civilians in Ukraine. So I decided, well, you know what, if Russian intelligence has nothing better to do with me than sending students, to learn from me about genocide, well, that, being a nerd, that's how I fight back. I will write a book, will donate what I make from sales to Ukraine, and, just spread the word. So that's how the book came out.
So that's a shocking and fascinating story. Of course, this was a case that all of us learned about through news reporting about it, and I think many colleagues ended up learning that who they thought was a student was actually a Russian intelligence operator. But you really took this, I think, probably because of your personal history as well, and also your expertise. I think it sounds like it was a defining moment in many ways, kind of recognizing that you are potentially a target of Russian intelligence operations, who knows, and that in, of course, an unknowing way, that you were somehow potentially helpful to this person, right? Which, again, of course, this happens to many people across the world, and we know how good Russian intelligence operators can be in doing these kinds of things. So I think on the whole, you got very lucky. I mean, you didn't do anything untoward, obviously, but it's a very telling story of how deep I think Russian intelligence service operators penetrated our own societies, and how little we actually know about many others who are potentially operating in similar ways. But to take it back to the book, there's something you said as you were just speaking that I wanted to go back to. And in the book, you tell a more than 200-year history of Ukraine in a very brief manner. I mean, I'm not a historian, thankfully, but most history books tend to be very long. And so being able to tell this long history and taking us all the way to the contemporary moment, the invasion, and where we are right now, I think is a masterful job. And someone who knows Ukraine very well, I learned a lot of things about Ukraine's history, not being a historian myself. So just for that, it's very worth reading to better understand the region. But there's a debate on one term that you use, and that's the term genocide. And you come out very clearly that what Russia is doing in Ukraine is in fact genocide. But I think that's a term that right now is getting maybe overused and definitely thrown around in the general debate and conversations around all kinds of different conflicts. And not all scholars agree that what Russia is doing in Ukraine is in fact genocide. So why do you come out so strongly in calling Russia's war against Ukraine genocide?
Right. Thanks, Alina. You're absolutely right. It's not everyone agrees, though I think on the Ukraine story, most have eventually, came to accept that at least there is a genocidal intention there going on. So why do I call it genocide? Because genocide is not about numbers, right? It's not about how many people kill. And in fact, if you look at the UN Convention for the Prevention and Punishment of the Crime of Genocide, it's not even about killing. You can carry out genocide without killing a single person. So for instance, transfer of children or preventing birth are explicitly genocidal acts. So what I saw, and that also goes back to me trying to wrap my head around, Russian violence in Ukraine, is trying to figure out, well, what exactly was going on there and why. After all, the perception, and I think Russians were quite sincere when they talked about Ukrainians as kind of little brothers, or people who speak the same language, and most people in Ukraine are bilingual, and quite a few of them are ethnic Russians, but they're also the targets of this violence. So it did not make sense to me, and when I tried to figure out what was going on, what I clearly saw is a lot of violence which was absolutely not genocidal and indiscriminate. So for instance, obliteration of Mariupol, I would not call it an act of genocide. It's a war crime and a crime against humanity, but there was no genocidal intent there. It's just how Russia fights. That's what they did in Grozny. That's what they have helped Assad to do in Aleppo. That's what they're likely have done in other places. Genocide, if you go to the legal definition, to the UN Convention, are acts taken with the intent to destroy a group as such. And in Mariupol, there was no such violence. There was no such attempt, at least in my view, to destroy, Ukrainians as such. But once you get beyond Mariupol and closer to Kyiv, places like Bucha, for instance, we see quite a lot of violence that is absolutely indiscriminate, just trigger happy Russian soldiers or soldiers who get drunk and start shooting. That's actually an extremely common occurrence. But within that, there is also a clear intent to target very specific people. People who, intelligentsia, civil society activists, teachers, state officials, veterans, so everyone who was politically involved, everyone who had any connection to Ukrainian national identity, not necessarily ethnic identity. It didn't really matter which language those people spoke or what was their ethnicity. It was an attempt to target everyone who is Ukrainian by nationality, by national choice, on the ground, we know that there were kill lists that for each locality, and people within the Russian military and the security services came into pretty much every village in northern Ukraine when they conquered at the very beginning, and I'm sure there are lists for every place in Ukraine with who to target, who to kill, and that was the explicit criteria. And in terms of statements and rhetoric, in April, the rhetoric also shifts from, that's the war of liberation. We're coming in to protect.
April 22?
Yeah, so, yeah, exactly. April 4th, April 5th. 2022, a clear shift from, we're coming to liberate Ukrainians who are being oppressed by those neo-Nazis, to we need to destroy Ukraine, we need to destroy Ukrainians, it will take generations. If needed, we will kill millions, but we will get this out of their bloodstream. And that's, for me, how the war that was not genocidal originally became a genocidal campaign. So intent to destroy Ukrainian, not as an ethnic identity, and not as an ethnic group. And that's, I think, what many people miss when they talk about Ukraine, because we historically tend to focus, when we talk about genocides, on ethnic identities or racial identities or religious identity. Here, I think the targeting is national. It's the idea to destroy Ukrainians as a national group linked to evidence of specific violence. So not just intent, but violence on the ground, and it has very little to do with numbers as such. But obviously, when we also learn beyond what was going on in northern Ukraine, and more about occupation policies. So for instance, taking thousands and thousands of children from occupied areas and moving them either physically to Russia to be re-educated, or putting them up for adoption, even though they have biological parents who want them and looking for them back in occupied territory, switching the curriculum, punishing people, torturing people just for speaking Ukrainian or having any signs of allegiance to Ukraine, like, quote unquote, patriotic tattoos. That's what gets you in trouble. So the more we learn, the more we see that, the violence is clearly targeted at Ukrainians as a group. It's not random. And that's why I call it genocidal.
No, thank you for that explanation, because again, I think this term gets thrown around a lot. But the way you link, the official UN definition as well as the combination of ideological views expressed by the oppressor and the aggressor paired with actions, I think is really important. I want to come back to this idea later about how the war has actually evolved and how it's evolved in terms of Putin's strategic thinking and the Russian elite, but also the Russian people. But I'll come back to that in a moment, because you brought up this issue of identity. And I think one of the, counterintuitive parts of the book, to my mind, but it's, I think, the central thesis of the book is that this war is not just not about territory, but it's also not about security. Because I think that is the main way in which we discuss Russia's war against Ukraine, is in terms of Russia's stated security concerns, right? About NATO expansion, for example, happening against Russia's expressed wishes and expressed security concerns about the NATO open door policy. Also stating falsely that Ukraine was going to join NATO, and that's why the invasion happened in 2022, and then prior to that in 2014 as well. And then the conversation now is how can the West guarantee security for Ukraine as a defense and deterrence for Europe as a whole? But you clearly state that security matters, but that's not what this is about, right? This is really about identity. And one of the other things I thought was pretty counterintuitive, and I think you get to this more to the end of the book, where you actually say that even NATO membership, which most people in the policy space see that as the ironclad security guarantee that will ensure the future of Ukraine as a sovereign state, maybe not along its 1991 borders, but as a state. And this is the ironclad security guarantee. But you say that that's not it's not really certain that even NATO would guarantee Ukraine's security and sovereignty because security from the Russian perspective is not the top priority. So can you explain that? Like why is this about identity first and security second?
Right. So identity is another term that is being thrown around quite a lot, especially recently. So let me tell you a bit what I mean. So I started with trying, the only historian on this panel is Sergei. So neither of us is an historian. So I never planned to write a historical book. I'm a wannabe historian. But as I tried to explain what exactly drives this violence, and started looking at 2022, I immediately realized that that's not going to do. I need to go back in time. I went back in time in 2014 and then started going back in time to Soviet times until suddenly I found myself dealing with, early 19th century Russian intellectuals and how they thought about Ukraine and how they suddenly discovered Ukraine simply because they couldn't go on the grand tour of Europe because of Napoleonic Wars. So Ukraine was the closest, this exotic land that they suddenly started discovering and claimed this there. So what exactly do I mean by identity? I do say quite explicitly that it is mostly an identity war. And, when I was, the key claim of this book is a very specific set of Russian ideas and perceptions about what Russia is and about what Ukraine is, and they're very stable over time and drive this war. So what this Russian identity is about? Well, essentially there are three components. First is that Russia traces its history, its sense of what Russia is, where it belongs, where it comes from, to a medieval state called Kievan Rus, which was most of contemporary Ukraine, most of Western Russia, all of Belarus, and that's fine, as long as you keep it history. But for Russians, this sense of origin also transformed over time to a sense of entitlement. You can't be Russian without having this part of land, either formally or informally. It's just not possible. And I remind you, Kiev is not just some mythical place, it's also a capital of a different country called Ukraine. So that's where the sense of ownership that's traditionally Russian land comes from. A second prong of this identity-based view is that the Russian people consist of three branches. The Great Russians, which are Russians without adjectives, the Little Russians, that is Ukrainians, and the White Russians, Belarusians. So those are essentially the same people. Now, when you start, originally the terms Great Russian and Little Russians were just geographic terms, like Asia Major and Asia Minor. But over time, when you start talking about Great and Little, it has to evolve into hierarchical relationship, and that's also what happens in the Russian-Ukrainian relations. Russians started viewing themselves as, the older brother, the responsible, the big one, and Ukrainians a close second, but still subordinate to the Russians. So this desire to go their own way and join NATO, it's not because it endangers our security. It's how the hell dare they, without asking us for permission. And the third part of this identity is that for all those three branches, there is only one real language of administration, of politics, of science, and that's Russian. Ukrainian is essentially a peasant dialect. And this is a peasant dialect that is being forcibly taught to people on the ground, but essentially all those people need to speak Russian. That's the only real language. The rest is the vernacular. And what I show in this book is, that this set of ideas, that's what drives Russian policies since mid-19th century throughout many regime changes, whether it's Russian Empire, Soviet Union, post-Soviet Russia. That's how they see themselves. That's how they see Ukraine. And without changing those perceptions, the borders or security guarantees are not going to fix it. As long as Russians believe that they ought and entitled to control Ukraine, well, they might not invade Ukraine if Ukraine is in NATO. But there are other tools to try to control Ukraine. Bribing politicians, electoral interference, disinformation, fake news. I mean, they have no problem using it in Central and Western Europe and in the US, and nothing would prevent them from doing so in Ukraine. In fact, they will be even more determined to do so in Ukraine. Ukraine might keep its de jure independence, but it will be another Belarus, for instance. That might be the model. And then the next question is whether we want a Belarus in NATO when we already have Hungary.
So I could ask a lot of questions about what you just laid out, but if I can just push this a little bit from a policy lens in particular, there is a lot of people, including many Ukrainian government officials, including President Zelensky, who are really pushing and advocating for Ukraine joining NATO as a security guarantee, as prevention from a second, third, fourth, fifth war of aggression that could and will likely emerge if we end up with some sort of temporary ceasefire, like we did with the Minsk agreements after the invasion of Crimea and the Donbass in 2014 and 2015. So I think the counterintuitive part here is you're saying that, okay, let's imagine a reality in which we have some sort of settlement and that Ukraine then becomes a NATO member, and yet this is actually not enough because Russia will continue to undermine Ukraine in all kinds of various hybrid tactics, if you will, political, economic pressure, energy, whatever it can to use to try to basically corrupt Ukraine from the inside, even if it's a NATO member. So I think then the question goes, then why even advance the idea that Ukraine should join NATO?
Well, it's not that, I'm against Ukraine joining NATO. I think that, it is probably necessary unless we want to avoid other alternatives like Ukraine trying to go nuclear, because that's essentially the choice that is being perceived by many Ukrainians. Either you give meaningful external security guarantees, or they will do whatever it takes to protect themselves. What I'm saying that it's insufficient. What I'm saying that to have a lasting peace, what is needed is to change Russian perspectives of what it is and what it is entitled to and who Ukrainians are. Now, I don't think that President Trump or anyone else can force this change on Russia as a policy. This change will have to come from within Russia. I think what we can do is to help to bring this change. For instance, by conditioning the removal of sanctions on central policies, like changing Russian curriculum that is now openly states that Ukraine does not exist, and Ukraine is not a real state, and Ukrainians are not real people. Or changing the official rhetoric by the Russian leadership and people around him and various think tanks that, Ukrainians are just an invention of the West, it's anti-Russia, it's a foreign project to undermine Russia. That we can do. I also think that it might emerge organically over time, because what I discovered while researching this book, that this understanding of what Ukraine is also quite flexible. Because if in both World Wars, World War I and World War II, the key Russian and Soviet objective was control of Galicia and Bukovina, which are now part of Western Ukraine. From their perspective, it was absolutely Russian land, no questions asked. But they encouraged such a resistance in those areas that right now, if you listen to, even the more crazy, the more nationalist part of the Russian government, people like Medvedev, yes, we want Ukraine, but the Western part, those areas, let Romania take them, let Poland take them. We want nothing to do with them. Those people are crazy nationalists, let them go their own way. So I think this can change. And, my guess is that, we don't have much information about, the conversations that Russian soldiers are having among themselves. My guess is that, they might be asking the very same questions that, Soviet soldiers were asking themselves in 1947 in Western Ukraine when they encountered a very bloody, very brutal counterinsurgency. Are those people like us? Do we need them? Are they brothers? And so I think there is room for hope. I just for me, and for me it's counterintuitive because I'm a quantitative political scientist by training. For me, just saying that counting tanks, counting material, deciding where borders are just not enough. It will not, in the long term, you need to change perceptions.
So on the Russia question then, we have all of these members of the Russian opposition, many of them who were released in a prisoner swap back in August of last year. And we work a lot with both Ukrainians and members of the Russian opposition, or those that find themselves in exile because of their opposition to the war. And a lot of these people, meaning the Russian opposition exile, believe that there is a democratic future for Russia and that this is the path to end Russian imperialism, which is what we're talking about here, vis-a-vis Ukraine, but more broadly as an ideology. So two-part question. One, I think I know what you're going to say, but I'm going to ask anyways. Do you believe that's the solution, the democratization of Russia, if it was possible? And two, do you actually think it's possible? Because I think if we're basically going to try a short history of Russia, what you see is centuries of imperialism by different names, and centuries of contraction followed by mass violence to regain those lost territories over and over again, in almost non-ideological ways, meaning the ideology changes, but the desire does not, to have a Russia beyond its own political borders, whether that's the Russian Empire, the Soviet Union, and now the current version of Putin's Russia. And the 1990s, which I think we could argue about this, but in my view, Russia did not become a democracy in the 1990s, although there were certainly the potential beginnings of that. But even that looks like a complete historical blip, sort of in the grand, arc of history, of Russian history. So one, do you think democratization is the path, if it was possible, like many Russian opposition leaders believe that to be the case, that if we have a democratic free Russia, it will become a so-called normal member of the international community and not want to destroy its neighboring states? And then two, given what we know about Russian history, is that even a likely possibility?
So, so the Russian opposition, I think, those people, or at least many of them, are definitely well-intentioned, but also extremely naive. And they're naive because they believe that democracy is a solution to all Russia's problem. I only wish they were right. Now, I obviously want to see a democratic Russia, I really hope to have my next book as a history of Russia becoming a normal, peaceful country. I know that it's not going to happen anytime soon if I ever want to write books. But ideally, yeah, I would definitely want to see Russia as a democratic state. I don't think it's Russia becoming a democracy on its own. Yes, I think it's possible. There are many countries that were believed as non-democratizable and became model democracies, such as Japan and Germany in the 1940s. There were quite a few people who believed that none of those countries can become democratic, and yes, and yet they did. There were many arguments about Central and Eastern Europe, whether after so many years of dictatorship and communism, they can become democracies. And yes, some of them did become Hungary, but others also did become the Czech Republic. For instance, so yes, democratization is possible. Whether it's going to fix much, no, not really, because we have on its own, because we do have the experience of 1990s where Russia, especially at the very beginning, did have, those institutions, but the mindset remained the same. The mindset was those Ukrainians, they will eventually come to their senses and join Russia to the extent that in 1994, 1995, people in Russian foreign ministry advised their colleagues in the West not to create embassies in Kiev because they're going to shut them down anyway pretty soon and convert them into consulates because Ukraine is going to join Russia. The rhetoric was that, those people, it's not a real state. Those people are essentially Russians. It's like, eventually someone will have to give, and there will be another solution or another constellation where Ukraine does rejoin Russia, a democratic liberal Russia, but rejoins nonetheless. There were people like Chubais, one of the key people in Yeltsin's government, openly talking about Russia as a liberal empire, whatever the hell this means. I have no idea, but that was the rhetoric. So democratization of Russia definitely would be a great thing. I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon. I would love to be proven wrong, but on its own, without changing the mindset, the regime itself is not going to do much.
So I have one last question, and I'm going to ask Sergei the same question before we open it up. And given what you just said and given what you describe as kind of the history of Russia's desire on Ukraine, and then this is really about identity, so has less to do with security, not nothing but less to do with security. There's this tendency to blame the invasion of 22 anyways, in particular on Putin specifically, and not the Russian people who are, of course, unquestionably also being oppressed and repressed in all kinds of different ways. Opposition leaders being killed, we know the story. But given what you were talking about earlier, and I said I'll come back to this, of the evolution of the war, do you now believe that this is Putin's war or is this Russia's war?
That's a great question. So obviously, without Putin, the war would not have happened, or at least it would not have happened the way it did, and it would not have happened in 2022. After all, every history book should have a subtitle, "It did not have to be this way," and it definitely did not have to be this way with Russia and Ukraine. After all, he could have made different decisions, and different Ukrainian policies. For instance, agreeing to submit to Russia and become a second Belarus would have prevented an invasion, right? So it's, and Putin is definitely quite sincere about his, imperialist or revanchist ambition. So one of the things that came as a huge surprise to me, I don't know if you're the same, but going before 2014, and so definitely before 2022, and even before 2014, we considered the regime in Russia as brutal, corrupt, autocratic, but also non-ideological. Right? Those people are deeply cynical. And when Putin and people around him started coming up with those proclamations or writing those articles about the historical unity of Russians and Ukrainians, the perception was, no, they don't really mean it, right? They're playing a game of coercive diplomacy, they're signaling something different, but in fact they were sincere. And I think at least I personally underappreciate over the years how sincere they are. So I think Putin is a true believer. I think a different president could have and would have made different choices. I think, if Yeltsin were president in 2022, we would not have had this war. It's absolutely clear. At the same time, Putin alone cannot fight this war. He can order the invasion, but he alone is not responsible for the violence on the ground and the mobilization and everything else that is going on, both in Russia and in Ukraine. So I think it's both. I think it definitely started as Putin's decision, but it also tapped into very deeply held ideas, not just about Ukraine, but about violence and about politics more generally, that many Russians did share. So it became a giant enterprise at the end.
So I want to ask Sergey, you've been sitting there quietly as the historian here, listening to a sociologist and political scientist to discuss history. But just my comment on that question, I want to hear, Sergey, what you think from a historian's perspective. But there's a difference between blame and responsibility. And I think while we can place the blame on Putin and the Russian elite, there is a collective responsibility of Russian society. And if we look back at the last time, at least the Soviet Union was in a major war, Afghanistan, where they lost a lot of people, but a fraction of what the casualties have been in the war in Ukraine. And that was the Soviet Union, which we saw as probably a far more oppressive totalitarian state than we understand or used to think that Russia was today. And we saw protests on the streets against the Soviet invasion of Afghanistan. And while the risk is so high now, I'm not sure it's higher than it would have been then. And so there is something profound, I think, that we need to think about that has changed in Russian society, particularly since Putin came to power 25 years ago, that is producing very, very different societal effects than we saw, in the 1970s when the Soviet Union was involved in the invasion of Afghanistan and losing far less than Russia is losing today. So Sergey, same question to you. Where do you see the war today? Is the blame with Putin, but the collective responsibility of the Russian people?
Thank you, Alina. And this is a really profound question. I agree with a lot of what you said and what Eugene has just alluded to in his remarks. I've been thinking about that for a long time and switching back and forth on this subject. If you remember, there was a book by H.E.P. Taylor called The Course of German History, which, when it was published in its day, was very polemical with regard to Germany. In fact, there was a lot of criticism against H.E.P. Taylor because he associated the German people with Nazism, effectively saying, well, it's the Germans are responsible. You cannot just blame Hitler. No, the German people were responsible. And when I was reading this book, I was reflecting on the present dilemma where we are today. And I also asked this question to myself, am I responsible as a Russian citizen? Of course, happily dual national, but as a Russian citizen, am I responsible despite the fact that I thought it's absolutely, horrible situation, despite the fact that when I had my opportunity to vote in Russia back in the day, I never voted for Putin. In fact, I went and protested against Putin and joined the big unsanctioned demonstrations which actually turned out to be very violent. Later, I decided that perhaps, given my advancing age, it's probably not a good idea for me to do that. But there are plenty of other Russians who did that, thousands and tens of thousands of people in Moscow. Are we responsible for that? And there is no answer to this question. And it is not difficult for me to answer this question sitting here in relative comfort in the West, even as I know that if you go to Russia today and if you start protesting, you end up in prison, right? You take out a little placard, you're immediately arrested. And when you think about the degree of conformism, for example, in the West. Now, we've had now a transfer of power in the United States, and one of the things that strikes me is that how much conformism in certain areas you actually see as a result of shifting political winds in Washington, and that makes me think, what? People are the same in many ways, and human nature remains the same across the board. It's very difficult then to make profound judgments, especially sitting in comfort. Nevertheless, a couple of points that I wanted to note on this. I think I agree fundamentally with what Eugene is saying here, and that is it's not just about Putin, it's about the Russians and their desire to be, I write about it in my own book, desire to be recognized for some kind of national greatness that really is disconnected from any kind of Marxist-Leninist ideology. Although we had it during the Cold War, we had it before the Cold War, we still have it now. The Russians have this bizarre ambition. Earlier in our seminar today up in the penthouse, John Bew actually referred to that as a will to power. there's this will to power. Now, he did not refer it in relation to Russia. I will not say who he referred it in relation to. But I think the Russians also have this will to power and wild ambition. They just want to be recognized for their some kind of national greatness. Russia's problem, of course, historically and still today, is their ambition far outstrips their means. And I think that is a tragedy for the Russian people. So what explains the fact that today the Russian society, even if I say that, a lot of people will say, wait a second, you've taken a position on this. What explains that the Russian society basically is behind Putin on this war? Is that a fair thing to say? I don't know, because, the polling, etc., we know the limitations of these things. We know the limitations of trying to gauge the public sentiment in basically an authoritarian country. Still, I have a hunch. I have a hunch based on nothing else but just my connections to Russia and deep and profound and very sad conversations with a lot of people in Russia, is that a lot of people in Russia do support this war. So why is that? I think part of that is they have not really, a lot of the population have not truly felt the costs of this war as much, certainly not as much as the Ukrainians, and that is a result of a particularly devious, intelligent approach that the Russian government has taken to this. We know that Putin tried to mobilize Russian males for service in the war in September 2022. That didn't go over so well. A lot of people fled the country. And so his approach since then has been to pay the Russians to go fight. Where does the money come from? Oh, the sale of oil to wonderful countries around the world, including China and India. They're buying Russian oil. This is how the Russians are financing their war against Ukraine. They're paying people to go and fight there. So there's less pressure on the rest of the population. Now, the economy, of course, in general is under stress. We know there are problems there, but they're not the problems on North Korean scale in the 1990s. The Russians are still basically doing okay, and the economy is still, despite the dramatic interest rates and all the other problems that we're aware of, is doing okay. And that is something that I think contributes to the Russians not particularly protesting about the war. Now, another obvious factor here, and Alina, I'm sure you will agree with me, and that is the fact that when Russia found itself in a state of actual conflict in Ukraine, there is a sense of a rallying around the flag here, and that even people who don't agree with Putin, who think, well, what is this guy doing? He's out of his mind. But now that the motherland is in danger, we have to rally around the flag and support this government because that's the only one we have. And so we've had the rallying around the flag effect, of course, intensified, amplified gigantically by Russian propaganda, internal propaganda more than external propaganda. Internally, a lot of propaganda and brainwashing is happening. So I think that is a part of that. And of course, the Russian government has also been fairly skillful in presenting this conflict as an existential war between Russia and the West. Now, it's not us about trying to destroy Ukraine. No, it is about the West trying to destroy us. Therefore, if we don't rally, if we do not stand shoulder to shoulder in our opposition to the West, well, see what will happen next. It'll be terrible, terrible, terrible. So that's sadly where we are at this particular moment. So I think, does that kind of answer the question? Maybe it identifies my position, but thank you for. I think you're passing the floor over to me. Okay, I already usurped the floor, which is too bad. But anyway, my role is to conduct the Q&A, and we have a few minutes for that. And I just wanted to say to folks who have joined us online that if you would like to pose a question, please write it into the Q&A box, and then I will be able to read it out. In the meantime, please let me open the floor here and see if people have any questions. Please raise your hand. We have people with microphones over there who will speak into the microphone. Introduce yourself first and foremost, and then ask your question. Thank you. Questions? Let's start with Veronica.
Hi, Veronica Angel, European University Institute. Congratulations on the book, Eugene. Excellent timing. Of course, could have had it a long time ago and maybe help a lot of people make better decisions. My question is, if Russia's intent is to destroy Ukraine, to erase Ukrainian identity and sovereignty, and if this has been a Russian obsession throughout centuries, where does that leave us with a universe in a universe in which, let's say that Russia unfortunately succeeds? Does it mean that someone could read your book and understand that, okay, then now it's business as usual with Russia. Russia doesn't actually want to go further, doesn't want to go beyond Ukraine. We're actually safe. Why are we making such a big deal out of defending Ukraine if we could just let go and buy some gas from the Russians?
Yeah, thanks. So thanks, Veronica. So, that's also something that I have been grappling with. Either, do Putin's ambition end at the border of Ukraine, or does he want something more? And, obviously we can't get into his brain. I would not want to get into his brain. It's a very dark place. But beyond that, so I honestly don't know. My hunch, what about what his end goal is. What I do know that without Ukraine, or without either de facto or de jure control of Ukraine, he cannot go any further. So Ukraine is definitely a key goal, but my suspicion is that it's just the necessary but a first step towards something else. I don't know what something else might be. Whether it's back to recreating the Russian Empire or the Soviet Union, what I do know that, and that's what Russians are telling themselves as well, that they cannot do it without Ukraine. Right, the question is whether we want to take the risk and discover what they do after they take Ukraine. I think it will be an extremely stupid policy decision to make. My hunch is that he does not stop with Ukraine and its vision. Where does he stop? I personally do not know. Maybe Sergei knows. Maybe others. I
have a direct phone line.
Okay.
Of course.
So yeah. So pick his brain if you can. Going back to who said it, Brzezinski, that without Ukraine, Russia is not an empire, but with Ukraine, it automatically becomes an empire. Well, this empire probably does not stop with Ukraine only. There is something beyond it. So it's not just, Ukraine is essential, but it's probably just the first step towards something else. And I don't know what this something else is.
You want to take any guesses?
Well, probably not Alaska, although, I know some people who want Alaska back. Oh. Probably not East Germany, but, the rest, like the former Soviet space, absolutely, yeah. Baltics, yeah. There is a reason why they're so worried. Poland, maybe.
We've got Stephanie, I think, right? Sorry, you go ahead first.
Yeah, thank you so much. Anna, first year current student at SAIS. Professor Finkel, thank you very much. I will be very happy to read the book. It sounds really interesting. My question would be, what do you think was the biggest mistake of policymakers in the West towards Russia that it led to the 2022 Russian invasion, given the fact that we had quite a few examples before?
Mm-hmm. Oh, there were many. I think if I start listing those mistakes, we won't get till the very. So I think the biggest mistake was, and not just, honestly, not just the policymakers, but also many experts of Russia, myself included, is not to taking the ideology part seriously, downplaying the beliefs. There were people who warned that they actually mean it. There were people already in the 1990s talking about Weimar Russia, and they were typically laughed out of the room because we thought that, this regime is I mean, they're cynical, they're corrupt, they're violent, but they're rational. They don't really mean it. So, and had we believed them, had we believed what they were sincerely trying to communicate to us, right? It's not that Russians conceal those beliefs. They, they said it time and again, and we just didn't listen. So had we taken them seriously, we might have done things differently and better prepared. I think so that's one mistake. The second mistake that comes close is the NATO summit in 2008, where NATO made the worst possible decision, signaling that Ukraine and Georgia will eventually join Russia, but without giving any specifics about that, and it achieved the worst of both worlds. Not that, it scared Putin that suddenly Ukraine will join NATO and it will be a threat to security, but it did lead to this reaction, how dare they? Who are they to even think about those terms? This land is ours, we should control it. So I think that was a huge mistake. Either, membership should have been put off the table, or there should have been something more specific given to Ukraine and Georgia, rather than this vague promise that exposed them to all those dangers. So for me, those are the top two mistakes, probably.
Okay, I think we have, yeah, go ahead. Do we have, yeah, Stephanie, yes.
Me second, I can wait.
No, you've got the microphone, of course.
Okay. I don't. Thank you so much, Eugene, and thank you so much, Alina, for organizing this conversation. Very subtle. I have a comment and question. One about Russia, which sounds thing, and another point about saying we need to change our perception. I think we have a problem, at least in Europe, and particularly, maybe it's a particular French problem, I don't know, but the way social sciences, the way studies are designed, Russian studies and Central Eastern studies and studies on Ukraine needs to be desovietized. I don't know exactly how to say, but I realize, and I'm not an expert on this region, but I have a very Russian perspective on these countries, and that I would like to mention the fact that we are trying to organize specifically studies on Ukraine. And also looking at a sort of different countries, within the Caucasus region and Eastern Bloc, but trying to look at it not from the post-Soviet studies, right? So I don't know if it's an issue here. I don't know if you would like to join the process, but this is a point. And about Russia and democracy, you were mentioning that everything is possible. We've seen countries in the past becoming democratic countries while they, past dependency was really strong. The examples you took, Germany, Hungary, Czechia, they were somehow part of the Enlightenment moment in the 18th, 19th century, and also the 1919 Weimar, constitution. And somehow in 1989, they went back to something that they knew before. And I also feel that in Russia took a particular decision after the collapse of the Soviet Union, and China believes that it was wrong because they started to be a constitutional democracy. So there is also two things which I think would prevent definitely democracy to arrive very soon after Mr. Putin. Is not only that democracy is challenged everywhere around the world, including in democratic countries, but also their neighbors, China, tend to tell to the Russians every day the collapse of the Soviet Union was the worst thing to do, and that the transition to democracy was not really successful at that time, and it landed up to the collapse of the Soviet Union. So I don't see. Is it reasonable to think in terms of democracy in Russia after Putin?
So I think possible doesn't mean likely. So I agree with you. I don't think it's likely anytime soon, and I don't think that Putin exiting the scene is going to change much. In fact, those opposition figures that Alina mentioned, I don't see them playing much of a role in the future of Russia right now. They're playing the opposition game, which is bickering among themselves while becoming increasingly irrelevant. So I don't think it's going to happen anytime soon, but I think it is possible. And in the history of Russia, there are Republican moment and democratic moment that they can capitalize on from the 20th century and even from medieval periods, if there is a desire. So likely, no. Possible? Yeah, I don't see why not. They can do it if they want to. In terms of, Russian perspective, the same is in the US and everywhere. Russia is a large country, so there is an incentive to see and understand and focus on Russia. That's where the imperial literature and culture and history come from. If you work on the region, you need to speak the language, and with that does come the perspective, at least when, I'm sure, Alina, it was in sociology as well, but when Alina and I were graduate students, working on Ukraine was a professional suicide. There will be no job, so if you want to study the region, you need to study Russia. So there is a pushback against that, but pushback. To achieve change, you need positions, and to achieve positions, you need funding, and we know the status of the higher education funding around the world. So yes, there is a push. I don't see it succeeding that much in the US and Europe. The only exception is Canada, actually, where there is quite a lot of research being done from other perspective, but that's because of the large Central and East European diasporas that invested or lobbied for government funding. There is philanthropy, but I don't see that as a model for the US or continental Europe or the UK.
Just a quick comment on this conversation. A lot of that problem that we're describing, where we have had a Russian lens on the so-called post-Soviet space, because we have defined it through the perspective of Moscow, because of the way that many academic programs have been structured. It's led to some pretty profound policy problems, because especially at SAIS, a lot of the students who get degrees here, very smart people, end up going to work in the US government in particular. And then some of those perspectives over the years, I'm not saying right now, but over generations, of Sovietologists and then Russianists, who are actually Sovietologists, get taken into the circles of policymaking, right, in all kinds of various ways. And I think, unfortunately, I'm not seeing that change either. Just speaking from the perspective of a Washington-based institution that works on European security, we have had fellowship programs, I think for both Ukrainian scholars and Russian scholars, independent Russian scholars. And there is basically no resources to support Ukrainian expertise or Ukrainian scholarship. And there's far more resources, even now, to support Russian experts and Russian scholars. And I think that is a huge problem, because what then happens is that you have conversations about Ukraine without Ukraine at the table and without Ukrainian experts at the table. And unfortunately, this continues to be the case today. And I think there's all kinds of ways that we can start to shift that, but resources are really the key. They really are. Sorry, Sergey, go ahead.
No, I think, Alina, that's absolutely right. I think the balance has to be struck somewhere in this question. Of course, I have contributed as somebody who has focused on Soviet foreign policy, on Moscow's motivations, to that kind of particular leaning to one side. I do think it's important to do both. That's my conviction. I think to understand this region, we have to have experts on Ukraine. We also have to have experts in Russia, because, as the Chinese say, it takes two hands to clap. It's both, really. We cannot cut one out. But in terms of resources, I think you're exactly right. At the moment, I think the tendency, it's very imbalanced still. It's very imbalanced. Right. We have, folks, let me take the last couple of questions, if I may, and we'll close with that, because we're running out of time. So please, go ahead.
Yeah, thank you so much for the presentation. My name is Jurek. I'm a current SAIS student, and previously I worked for the German government, so it's kind of touching into this entire idea of also how does this relate to policy. You titled your book Intent to Destroy, and my question is twofolded. One, is Ukraine really this like sui generis case for Russian imperialism? It is a multi-ethnic state that has a history of pushing its borders, of destroying national identities. So for policy perception, when we talk about like Ukraine, do we have to see it as it's a singular case, and if Ukraine is falling either way, that's going to be it? Or will this policy of like destroying identities continue, and you have this like expansionist, imperialist narrative like deeply ingrained in Russian like foreign policy? And the second part to the question would be, is that policy then unique to Russia, or is that unique to revisionist imperialist countries? And having my former professor behind me as a China expert, China obviously also is a case that a lot of policymakers are talking about, looking at Russia, but looking also at Tibet, at Taiwan. Yeah.
Okay, very good. Do we have further questions? Guido, did you?
Thanks for the very interesting presentation and discussion. A quick question. You kind of presented the main thesis in your book as this being a 200-year quest of Russia to destroy Ukrainian identity. What is the minimum in your mind that Russia needs to achieve to call it a success this time?
Very good. I think we'll wrap up with those two questions.
Whether it's I'm not an expert on China. I won't be able to answer that, especially since you have the real experts sitting either here or just behind you. So, in terms of whether it's a singular case, no, I don't think it's singular. I think that the emotion is more powerful. It's more raw. It's more touchy, if you feel. It's much stronger when it comes to Ukraine, but it's not unique. So, and we see similar processes happening elsewhere. Of course, that the idea that Russians complicate things and makes the desire to more powerful. But we see similar processes also in Russian expansion elsewhere. So no, not singular, but definitely more extreme. Guido's question. So in terms of what the minimum for Russia to succeed, to call it a day, I would say the very minimum would be de facto, if not de jure, control over the government in Kyiv, veto power, and that's essentially what they were after in 2022. It was not a war of conquest, it was a war of regime change. So a veto power over foreign policy and security decisions done by the Ukrainian. That's what they tried to achieve since 2014 by trying to insert the breakaway regions, the people republics, quote unquote, reintegrate them into Ukraine with special veto powers over those decisions and special status for the Russian language. To make, right now, Russian language is not a state language in Ukraine, but obviously Russian is a much larger country with more resources, so making Russian an officially recognized state language will open the door for the Russification, at least from the Russian perspective. So I think if they can achieve that, they will definitely call it a win.
Okay, Alina, last word.
So again, Eugene, congratulations on this great book. I hope people will buy, if not right here, then on Amazon and elsewhere, bookstores. I think it's very much worth a read to understand the complex history that goes far, far beyond 22 and 2014. Just a quick comment on the policy side, given this is what I do and have been doing for a while. And this question of what was the mistake that Western policymakers made, if there was one. Well, I definitely agree with what you said about Bucharest and not having an actual plan after that summit, and that's sending all the wrong signals to Georgia, Ukraine, and Russia. But I think that the biggest error that we made, and in no way am I saying that the West is to blame for the war. It's Russia that is to blame for the war, and that's the obvious thing. But I think when we crafted the policy in response to the full-scale invasion, we crafted it against things we didn't want to happen versus things we wanted to achieve, meaning the entire Western policy led by Washington, the last administration, was in the avoidance of nuclear war, not with the goal of Ukraine's victory. And we ended up exactly where we are. I think because of that, in a war that has probably cost a lot more than it should have, or could have, I should say, and a war that very much looks like a painful war with attrition for the Ukrainian side and also for the Russian side. And that is, I think, a big mistake that we made in the response to the full-scale invasion. But thank you for your time. Thank you for writing this book. And thank you, everyone, for joining us for this conversation, especially to our chair and historian, Sergei Radchenko. It was great to have this conversation with both of you. Thank you.
Thank you.